The music had barely reached its second song when a gloved hand closed around Elena Voss's wrist and pulled her behind a marble pillar. "Do not move," a voice hissed near her ear. "There are 2 guards checking masks at the east door, and they are working their way down the hall." Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. She had known the risk the moment she slipped past the gate using a stolen invitation, but knowing a danger and feeling it close around your throat were 2 very different things. She turned her head just enough to see the girl who had grabbed her, a stranger in a green gown with sharp eyes and an even sharper voice. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "Do not thank me yet. Just walk like you belong here, and do not look back at them." The stranger vanished into the crowd before Elena could ask her name. There was no time to wonder about her anyway. The grand hall of the Ashcroft estate glittered with 1,000 candles, and every person inside it, every alpha, every noble, every guard, was watching for exactly the kind of intrusion Elena represented. She was not invited. She did not belong to a ranked pack. She was, by every law that governed this world, someone who should never have been allowed through the front gate. But she was here, and she intended to see him, just once, before the night ended. She smoothed the silver mask against her face and stepped out from behind the pillar, letting the current of dancers carry her toward the center of the room. The ballroom smelled of beeswax candles, crushed roses, and something wilder underneath it all. The scent of hundreds of wolves gathered in human skin, restrained but never quite hidden. Elena had grown up on the edges of pack territory, far from grand halls like this one, and the sheer density of power in the room made the fine hairs on her arms rise. She was not supposed to be able to sense rank the way trained nobles could. But even she felt it the moment Damien Ashcroft entered the hall. The room did not go silent. Not exactly, but something in it shifted, the way the air shifts before a storm breaks. Conversations dimmed. Backs straightened. Even the musicians seemed to find a slightly more confident rhythm. Elena turned toward the grand staircase and saw him for the first time in person. The Alpha King, dressed in black, his shoulders set with the kind of authority that could not be taught, only inherited and then earned all over again every single day. She had seen paintings of him. They had not done him justice. And more importantly, they had failed entirely to capture the thing that struck her hardest, the way his eyes moved over the crowd like he was already tired of every person in it. Elena told herself, quite firmly, that she had no business staring. She told herself she would watch from a distance, memorize this one impossible night, and slip out before anyone noticed a girl who did not belong. That had been the entire plan. The plan did not survive the first dance. A hand appeared in front of her, palm up, and a voice she did not recognize asked her to dance. She almost said no. Then she saw the crest on his sleeve and realized refusing an invitation from a ranked wolf in this hall might draw exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid, so she accepted and let herself be pulled into the slow-turning current of the dance floor. Her partner was pleasant enough, though he asked too many questions about her family and her pack, questions she answered with practiced vagueness. She was halfway through inventing a cousin from a coastal territory when the song ended and the dancers rotated, as was the custom in this kind of formal gathering, passing from partner to partner like pieces on a board. She did not realize who her new partner was until his hand had already closed around hers. The first thing she felt was heat, a warmth that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere behind her ribs. The second thing she felt was his gaze, fixed on her with an intensity that made every carefully rehearsed excuse dissolve out of her mind. She looked up and found herself staring directly into the eyes of Damien Ashcroft. For a moment, neither of them moved. The other dancers swirled around them, oblivious, but Elena felt as though the entire hall had gone still. "You dance like someone who has never danced in a room this large," he said, and there was no mockery in it, only observation. "Is that a complaint, my lord?" "No." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "It is the first honest thing I have seen all evening." They began to move together, and Elena forced her breathing to stay even, though every instinct in her body screamed that something enormous was happening, something she did not have the vocabulary to name. She had heard stories about fated bonds her whole life, whispered in the way people whisper about miracles they never expect to witness. She had never believed the stories were meant for someone like her. "You are not going to tell me your name," Damien said. It was not a question. "Would it change how you look at me if I did?" "I doubt it could change how I am looking at you now." Elena's pulse climbed higher. Somewhere behind him, she caught sight of a tall man in a captain's uniform scanning the crowd, methodically, the way a soldier scans a battlefield for a target. She recognized the look on his face immediately. He was searching for someone who did not belong. He was searching for her. "I need to go," she said quickly. "You have barely arrived." "I have somewhere to be." Damien's grip on her hand tightened, gentle but unmistakable. Somewhere more important than this? For one reckless heartbeat, Elena considered staying. She considered telling him the truth. Right there in the middle of the dance floor, in front of every noble and guard in the kingdom. Then she saw the captain's eyes sweep past a woman near the fountain, dismiss her, and continue moving directly toward the dance floor, toward them, and the fantasy collapsed under the weight of what discovery would actually mean. "I am sorry," she said, and pulled her hand free. She did not run. Running would have drawn eyes. Instead, she walked, quickly and purposefully, toward the terrace doors at the edge of the hall, weaving between clusters of guests with the kind of practiced calm she had learned from years of not wanting to be noticed. Behind her, she heard Damien say something to a nearby servant, his voice low and urgent, and she knew without turning around that he had not simply let her go. The terrace air hit her like cold water, sharp and clean after the crowded heat of the ballroom. Below the stone railing, the palace gardens spread out in the dark, hedges cut into elaborate shapes, fountains catching threads of moonlight. Elena did not hesitate. She climbed onto the railing, judged the drop to the garden below, and jumped, landing hard in a bed of soft soil that cushioned the fall enough to keep her upright. There. A voice cracked across the garden, sharp with command. Someone came off the terrace. Elena's blood turned to ice. She had been seen. She ran then, no longer caring about grace or calm, sprinting through the hedge maze with her skirts bunched in her fists, her mask slipping sideways across her face. Behind her, she heard boots pounding against stone, several sets, closing the distance far faster than she had hoped. Guards in this territory were not ordinary men. They were wolves at the height of their strength, and outrunning them on open ground was close to impossible. She cut left instead of right, ducking through a gap in the hedge too narrow for a grown man to follow easily, scraping her arm against the branches hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. She heard a curse behind her as one of the guards misjudged the turn and crashed into the greenery. It bought her 3 seconds. 3 seconds was not much, but it was something. The outer wall of the estate rose ahead of her, high and smooth, but ivy had grown thick along one section near the old gatehouse, and Elena had spent a childhood climbing far more dangerous things than a wall. She grabbed a fistful of vine, tested it, and began to climb, her arms burning, her lungs screaming for air she did not have time to take. "Stop!" The voice was closer now, and it was not the captain's voice. It was Damien's. She almost looked back. Almost. But looking back had never once, in the whole history of the world, helped anyone escape anything, so she kept climbing, reached the top of the wall, and threw herself over without checking what waited on the other side. She landed badly, rolling through wet grass, pain lancing up through her ankle, and for one terrible moment, she thought she would not be able to stand. Then she forced herself upright, gritting her teeth against the throb in her leg, and limped into the tree line beyond the estate grounds, into shadows the guards' torches could not reach. Behind the wall, she heard Damien's voice one more time, quieter now, almost lost in the wind. "Find her mask. Find anything she left behind. I want to know who she is before the sun rises." Elena pressed herself against the trunk of an old oak, hand clamped over her mouth to keep her breathing silent, and listened to the sound of a search beginning that she knew, with a sick certainty settling into her stomach, was not going to end simply because she had escaped one garden wall. She had wanted one night, one glimpse of the king everyone spoke about in hushed, reverent tones, a story to keep to herself for the rest of her ordinary life. Instead, she had left behind a torn scrap of fabric from her sleeve, caught somewhere in the ivy, and a version of herself that Damien Ashcroft would apparently not simply forget. She limped through the dark toward the road that led back to her village, her ankle throbbing with every step, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong now that the Alpha King had looked at her the way he had. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself the mask had hidden her face, that the darkness had hidden her scent trail well enough, that by morning this would all seem like a strange and impossible dream. She did not yet know that wolves like Damien Ashcroft did not forget a scent once it had marked itself against their instincts. She did not know that somewhere behind her, in a ballroom suddenly emptied of its music, a king stood holding a torn piece of silver fabric, like it was the only clue in the world worth chasing. She only knew that she needed to get home before her sister noticed she was gone, and that whatever she had started tonight, there would be no simple way to end it. Captain Felix Bram had served the Ashcroft Pack for 11 years, and in all that time he had never seen Damien cancel a ceremony with less than a day's warning. Yet there he stood, at dawn, in the map room of the estate, informing 3 visibly furious pack elders that the mate-choosing ceremony scheduled for that very evening would not be taking place. "You cannot simply postpone tradition because a girl ran from you at a party," said Elder Victor Cray, his voice sharp with disbelief. "The choosing has been fixed on this date for 6 months. Every noble family with an eligible daughter has already traveled here." "I am not postponing it," Damien said. "I am ending it. There will be no choosing ceremony this season." "On what grounds?" Damien set the torn scrap of silver fabric on the table between them, smoothing it flat with 2 fingers. It still carried, faintly, a trace of a scent none of them could identify, though Damien could have picked it out of 100 others without effort. "On the grounds that I have already found the person I intend to claim," he said. "I simply do not yet know her name." Victor stared at the fabric as though it had personally insulted him. "You want to delay the future of this pack for a woman who ran from your own guards rather than reveal herself?" "She did not run from me," Damien said. "She ran from being caught." "Is there a difference?" "There is every difference." Damien's voice had gone quiet, which Felix had learned over the years was far more dangerous than shouting. "A woman who does not want me runs and does not look back. She looked back 3 times. Felix said nothing, though privately he agreed the distinction mattered less than his king seemed to believe. Still, he had known Damien long enough to recognize when an argument was already lost before it began, and this was clearly one of those mornings. "Then what do you propose?" Victor asked, arms folded. "That we hunt through every territory in the kingdom for a woman in a silver mask?" "Yes," Damien said simply. "That is exactly what I propose." The search that followed was, in Felix's professional opinion, one of the strangest operations he had ever organized. There was no name to work from, no portrait, no family crest to trace. All they had was a scrap of fabric, a general description, dark hair, a slight frame, an accent that did not belong to any of the noble houses in attendance, and a scent trail that had gone cold somewhere past the estate's outer wall. Felix divided his trackers into small groups and sent them out along every road leading away from the estate, instructing them to visit villages, inns, and market squares, asking after any woman who had returned home in the early hours of that morning with a torn sleeve or an unexplained injury. It was slow work, and the kind of work that made enemies, because no family wanted royal guards questioning their daughters, whether or not those daughters had anything to hide. Marcus Kane, alpha of the neighboring Kane pack and Damien's oldest rival, made his opinion on the matter known within days. He arrived at the estate uninvited, dressed in his usual dark green, wearing the same faintly amused expression he always wore when he believed he had found a weakness worth exploiting. "I hear you called off the choosing," Marcus said, settling into a chair across from Damien without waiting for permission. "For a masked woman who would not even give you her name. That is either the most romantic thing I have ever heard or the most reckless. I did not ask for your opinion. No, but you are going to get it anyway, because unlike your elders, I am not afraid to say it plainly. A king without a declared mate is a king with a vulnerability, and every alpha in this kingdom knows it, including me." Damien met his gaze without flinching. "Is that a threat?" "It is an observation." Marcus smiled, unhurried. "Though I will say, if this mystery woman does not resurface soon, some of us may start to wonder whether the ceremony was cancelled because of a bond, or because of cold feet. Perception matters, Damien, even for kings." After Marcus left, Felix found Damien standing at the window of the map room, staring out at the gardens where the search had begun, his jaw tight. "He is not entirely wrong," Felix said carefully. "The longer this goes unresolved, the more it looks like weakness to the other packs." "I know. Do you want me to widen the search?" Damien turned from the window. "Widen it. Every village within 3 days' travel. I want to know who she is before Marcus finds a way to use her absence against us." It was on the 4th day of the search that one of Felix's trackers, a sharp-nosed young wolf named Owen, returned from the Western Road with news that finally gave them something solid to follow. He had visited a cluster of villages near the old river crossing and picked up fragments of a scent that matched the fabric sample closely enough to be worth investigating further. The trail led to a small settlement called Hollow Bend, a place so far from the estate that most of the noble families in attendance at the ball would never have thought to travel there, let alone claim residence. "It is not a noble territory," Owen reported. "It is barely a territory at all. A handful of families, mostly unranked, living off farming and river trade. If the woman you are looking for came from there, she would have needed a stolen invitation to even get through the gate." Damien's expression sharpened with interest, rather than dismissal, which surprised Felix more than he expected. "Send word to the household there, discreetly. I do not want a company of armed guards marching into a village that small. It will terrify them into silence rather than cooperation." Meanwhile, in Hollow Bend, Elena Voss had spent 4 days telling herself that the danger had passed. Her ankle had healed enough that she no longer limped, and the scrape on her arm from the hedge had faded to a thin pink line easily hidden under a sleeve. She had not spoken a word about the ball to anyone except her older sister, Grace, who had noticed the state of her dress the moment Elena crept back through their cottage window at dawn and had refused to let the subject drop since. "You went to the palace," Grace said again, on the 4th evening, as they sat shelling beans by the fire. "You actually went, with a stolen invitation, and danced with the Alpha King, and then you climbed a wall and jumped into a garden. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it was." "It sounds exactly as bad as it was, Elena." Grace set down her bowl, her expression caught somewhere between fear and exasperation. "Do you understand what would happen if anyone connected you to that mask? You know what you carry. You know what our mother always told us about the mark." Elena's hand moved instinctively to the inside of her wrist, where a faint pattern lay hidden beneath her sleeve, pale and easy to miss unless someone knew exactly where to look. Their mother had called it an old bloodline mark, a remnant from an ancestor whose name had been erased from every official record generations ago, and she had always spoken of it in a hushed voice, as though even saying too much about it out loud might summon trouble to their door. "No one saw the mark," Elena said. "It was dark. I was careful." "You are never as careful as you think you are." Grace's voice softened, though the worry did not leave her eyes. "Elena, if the king's men are searching for the woman from that ball, and they are, everyone in the market is talking about it, then it is only a matter of time before that search reaches us. Hollow Bend is small. People notice things. People remember a girl who came home the morning after the ball with a torn dress. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that 4 days of silence meant the danger had drifted elsewhere, but some quiet, honest part of her recognized that Grace was right. She had felt it too, a prickling unease every time a stranger passed through the village square, every time a rider approached from the eastern road. 3 days later, that unease proved justified. Elena was drawing water from the village well when she heard the sound of hooves approaching, more than one set, moving with the disciplined rhythm of trained soldiers rather than the loose gait of ordinary travelers. She kept her head down and continued filling her bucket, forcing her hands to stay steady, and watched from beneath her lashes as 3 riders in royal colors entered the square and dismounted near the village elder's house. She recognized the tall one immediately, even from a distance, even without the black formal coat he had worn at the ball. Something in the set of his shoulders, the quiet authority in the way he moved, told her exactly who had just ridden into Hollow Bend. Damien Ashcroft had come looking for her himself. Elena set down the bucket with hands that had gone suddenly cold and forced herself to walk, not run, toward the narrow lane that led back to her cottage. Behind her, she heard the village elder greeting the riders with nervous formality, heard fragments of questions about a woman, a masked ball, a torn silver dress, and she quickened her pace without breaking into an obvious run, every instinct in her body screaming that the 4 days of safety she had allowed herself to believe in had just come to an abrupt and terrifying end. By the time she reached her cottage, Grace was already at the door, her face pale. "They are here," Grace whispered. "The king's men. They are asking questions in the square." "I know," Elena said. "I saw. What do we do?" Elena looked past her sister, out the small window toward the village square, where she could just make out the tall, dark-haired figure of the man she had danced with 4 nights ago, standing in the afternoon light, patient and utterly unwilling, it seemed, to give up the search that had brought him here. Something in her chest tightened at the sight of him, a feeling she did not have a comfortable name for, equal parts fear and something dangerously close to longing. "We do nothing," Elena said finally. "We wait, and if they come to this door, I will find a way to make sure they leave, believing there is nothing here worth finding." She did not fully believe her own words, even as she said them, but there was no other plan available, and the sound of boots on the lane outside was already growing closer. The knock came at dusk, 3 measured raps against the wooden door, and Elena felt every muscle in her body lock into stillness. Grace answered it, because Elena's voice had abandoned her entirely, and for one long moment the 2 sisters stood frozen, while a royal guard, not Damien himself, but a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, asked whether any woman in the household had attended the recent gathering at the Ashcroft estate. "No one from this house was invited to any gathering," Grace said, and her voice held steady in a way Elena silently admired. "We are farming people, sir. We do not receive invitations from palaces." The guard studied her for a long moment, then glanced past her shoulder into the dim interior of the cottage, where Elena stood near the hearth with her back deliberately turned, pretending to stir a pot that did not need stirring. She kept her breathing slow and even, though her pulse hammered loud enough that she was half convinced the guard could hear it from the doorway. "We are asking in every household," the guard said eventually. "A formality. Apologies for the disturbance." He left. Elena did not move until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely from the lane outside, and even then, her hands shook as she set down the wooden spoon. "That will not be the end of it," Grace said quietly, once the door was shut and barred. "They will come back. Or someone in this village will remember something they should not, and mention it in passing, and it will find its way to the wrong ears eventually. Elena, you cannot stay here. This is our home, and it is the first place they will search again, now that they know to look here." Grace crossed the room and took her sister's hands, her grip firm despite the fear still visible in her eyes. "Go to Ivy. She has family in Brackenfield, past the river crossing. It is close enough that you are not truly running from everything, but far enough that a search built around this village will not reach you easily. Take a different name. Wait until this settles. Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that hiding was a coward's answer to a problem she had created for herself. But she thought of the mark on her wrist, of everything her mother had warned them about, and she understood that this was no longer only about her own safety. If the guards traced the mask back to this cottage and discovered what her bloodline carried, the consequences would not stop with her. They would fall on Grace as well, and on every relative who shared their blood. She left 2 days later, before sunrise, with a small bag of belongings and a new name settled uneasily on her tongue. Mila. It felt foreign, like a coat that did not quite fit, but she practiced saying it under her breath the entire journey to Brackenfield, until it began to feel almost natural. Ivy welcomed her without hesitation, asking few questions beyond what was necessary, which was exactly the kind of friend Elena had always known her to be. Brackenfield was larger than Hollow Bend, busier, filled with enough strangers passing through on trade routes that one more unfamiliar face barely drew a glance. For the first week, Elena allowed herself to believe she had finally found somewhere safe enough to breathe. That belief lasted exactly 9 days. She was in the market square, helping Ivy's aunt sell preserved fruit at a small stall, when a company of riders entered the town with the unmistakable bearing of royal guards. Elena's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stay where she was, arranging jars on the table with hands that did not shake this time, because she had learned, if nothing else, that panic drew more attention than stillness ever did. It was not, this time, a routine sweep of the countryside. Damien Ashcroft himself rode at the front of the company, and beside him rode a woman Elena did not recognize, dressed in the deep blue of a diplomatic envoy, her expression sharp and assessing as she surveyed the square. Elena kept her head down, focused on the jars in front of her, and told herself that a king visiting a market town for official business had nothing to do with her search at all. Kings traveled through their territories constantly. This meant nothing. She almost believed it, until Damien dismounted directly in front of the fruit stall. "These preserves smell excellent," he said, and Elena's heart stopped entirely at the sound of his voice, close enough now that there was no mistaking it. "What is in them?" "Plum and honey, my lord," Ivy's aunt answered, delighted by the unexpected royal attention, entirely unaware of the way the girl beside her had gone rigid. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the jars, praying silently that 4 days of firelight and a silver mask had disguised her well enough that nothing about her ordinary daylight face would spark recognition. She had cut her hair shorter since the ball, worn plainer clothes, adopted the quieter posture of someone who did not wish to be noticed. Still, when Damien's gaze drifted from the jars to the woman arranging them, she felt it land on her like a physical touch. "Have we met?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion rather than suspicion. Elena forced herself to meet his eyes, because looking away too quickly would have seemed far more suspicious than a brief, ordinary glance. "I do not believe so, my lord. I would remember." Something flickered across his face, a small crease of uncertainty, as though a familiar note had sounded somewhere just out of tune. He studied her a moment longer, and Elena held perfectly still under the weight of his attention, willing her scent, her expression, everything about her to read as unremarkable. "My apologies," he said finally. "You resemble someone I am searching for. It is nothing." He purchased 2 jars of the plum preserve, more out of courtesy than genuine interest, Elena suspected, and moved on with his company toward the town hall, where the local officials had already gathered to greet him. Elena did not fully exhale until the last of the royal horses had disappeared around the corner of the square. "You knew him," Ivy said quietly, once her aunt had wandered off to greet a neighbor. It was not a question. "I do not want to talk about it here." "Elena." "Mila," Elena corrected, glancing around at the crowded square. "Please, not here." That evening, in the small room Ivy had given her at the back of the family's house, Elena finally told her friend the truth. All of it. The stolen invitation, the dance, the desperate escape over the garden wall, and the mark hidden beneath her sleeve that made the entire situation far more dangerous than a simple case of royal curiosity. Ivy listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with every detail. "You have to leave Brackenfield," Ivy said, when Elena finished. "Tonight, if you can manage it." "He did not recognize me." "Not yet. But he felt something, Elena. I watched his face. And if he stays in this town even one more day, asking the kind of questions kings ask when they are searching for someone, it will not take much for the pieces to come together. This town is not big enough to hide you from that kind of attention twice." Elena knew her friend was right, but exhaustion pressed down on her, the accumulated weight of weeks spent running, hiding, inventing new names and new histories to protect a truth she had never asked to carry. For one reckless moment, she considered simply walking back to the town hall and telling Damien everything. The ball, the mask, the mark, all of it. And letting whatever happened next simply happen. She did not do it. The memory of her mother's warnings, whispered over years of careful secrecy, held her back even now. She left Brackenfield before dawn the next morning, this time without even telling Ivy exactly where she intended to go, because the less anyone knew, the safer they would all be if the questions ever came looking for them. She traveled north, toward a stretch of territory she had heard described as loosely governed, neither fully claimed by the Ashcroft Pack nor by any of its rivals. A strip of borderland where a woman without a name might disappear into the ordinary rhythm of daily work without drawing notice. What Elena did not know as she walked the dusty road north with her bag slung over one shoulder and her new false name already growing heavier than the last, was that a woman in deep blue robes had watched the entire exchange at the fruit stall with far sharper eyes than Damien's. Nora Ashwell served as an envoy for Marcus Kane, though few in the Ashcroft court knew the full extent of her loyalties, and she had learned long ago that the smallest details often mattered more than grand ones. She had noticed, in the brief moment Elena reached across the stall to steady a tilting jar, the pale mark visible just below the hem of her sleeve, a pattern she recognized instantly from old texts she had once studied, out of nothing more than idle curiosity. She said nothing to Damien. She said nothing to anyone in the Ashcroft Company at all. Instead, 3 days later, once the royal party had returned to the estate and the search had temporarily quieted, Nora rode east toward Marcus Kane's territory with a single piece of information she suspected would be worth far more than any diplomatic favor she could have negotiated in the market square. The girl the king was searching for was not simply hiding an unranked bloodline. She carried a mark that, according to the oldest laws still recognized by the Pack Council, made any union between her and a ruling alpha forbidden entirely. Marcus listened to her report in silence, and by the time she finished, a slow, satisfied smile had settled across his face, the expression of a man who had just been handed a weapon far sharper than anything he could have forged himself. The borderland town of Fen Hollow was exactly as loosely governed as Elena had hoped, a scattered collection of homes and workshops built along a slow-moving river, populated by people who had drifted there precisely because they preferred not to be counted too closely by any ruling pack. She found work within a week, mending nets for a small fishing operation and a room above a bakery whose owner asked nothing beyond her name, the false one, Mila, and her willingness to pay rent on time. For nearly 3 weeks, nothing happened at all, and Elena allowed the tight coil of fear in her chest to loosen, slowly, day by day, until she almost remembered what it felt like to simply exist without watching every stranger who passed. Then, a rider arrived from the Ashcroft estate, and everything tightened again. It was not, this time, a search party. It was a single envoy, formally dressed, carrying a request from the Alpha King himself for skilled translators familiar with the old river dialects, needed for a delicate negotiation with a delegation from the Northern Territories who refused to conduct business in the common tongue. Fen Hollow, sitting as it did at the crossing point of several old trade routes, had more fluent speakers of the river dialects than almost anywhere else in the kingdom. Elena had grown up hearing her grandmother speak the old dialect at home, one of the few pieces of heritage her family had never entirely let go of, and when the town elder came asking whether anyone might be willing to travel to the estate for a modest payment, several of her neighbors immediately suggested her name. She wanted, desperately, to refuse. Traveling to the estate meant walking directly back into the one place in the kingdom most likely to end in her discovery. But refusing too quickly, in a town this small, would draw exactly the kind of curious attention she had spent weeks avoiding, and the payment offered was more than she would earn in 2 months of mending nets, money her family in Hollow Bend badly needed. She agreed, telling herself the negotiation would likely last only a day or two, that she would keep her head down, do her work, and disappear again before anyone had reason to look at her twice. The estate looked different in daylight, stripped of candlelight and music, filled instead with the ordinary bustle of a working court, clerks carrying stacks of papers, guards changing shifts, servants hurrying between kitchens and dining halls. Elena was led to a modest meeting room near the eastern wing, along with 2 other translators from Fen Hollow, and given a brief overview of the negotiation's purpose before the northern delegation arrived. She did not expect Damien to attend the session personally. Kings, she had assumed, delegated matters like trade agreements to their ministers. But he entered the room 20 minutes into the negotiation, took a seat at the head of the table, and Elena felt every carefully rebuilt piece of her composure threatened to crack all over again. He did not recognize her immediately. She kept her voice low and formal during the translation work, her posture different from the woman who had danced with him at the ball, her expression carefully neutral. For nearly an hour, the negotiation proceeded smoothly, and Elena allowed herself to hope she might survive the day without incident. Then, during a brief pause while the northern delegation conferred among themselves, Damien turned to her directly. "Your accent," he said. "It is not quite the same as the other translators. Where did you learn the dialect?" "My grandmother, my lord," Elena said, keeping her eyes on the papers in front of her, rather than meeting his gaze. "She came from further up the river." "You are from Fen Hollow?" "I live there now, yes." "And before that?" Elena felt the question land with more weight than a casual conversation warranted, and she glanced up briefly, only to find him studying her with an intensity that made her pulse stumble. There was no accusation in his expression, not yet, only a kind of puzzled attentiveness, as though he were trying to place a familiar melody he could not quite name. "Many places, my lord," she said carefully. "My family moved often when I was young." He did not press further, though the crease of uncertainty she had seen once before, back in the Brackenfield Market Square, returned to his brow and did not entirely fade for the remainder of the session. When the negotiation concluded that evening, successfully, with both delegations satisfied enough to sign a preliminary agreement, Elena gathered her things quickly, eager to collect her payment and leave, before Damien found another reason to study her too closely. She did not manage to leave quickly enough. "A word before you go," Damien said, catching her near the corridor that led out of the eastern wing. The other translators had already gone ahead, and for the first time since the ball, Elena found herself entirely alone with him. "My lord, your work today was excellent. The northern delegation is notoriously difficult to satisfy, and you managed it without a single misstep." He paused, studying her in the fading evening light filtering through the corridor windows. "I would like to retain your services, if you are willing. There will likely be further negotiations in the coming months." Elena's mind raced through the implications of accepting, weighing the desperately needed income against the obvious danger of repeated proximity to a man who already seemed to sense something familiar about her, something he could not yet name, but clearly had not stopped searching for. "I would need to discuss it with my employer in Fen Hollow," she said, which was not quite a refusal, though she intended it to function as one in practice. Of course. He did not move to let her pass immediately, and something in his expression shifted, softened, into something Elena found far more difficult to guard against than suspicion. "May I ask you something unrelated to the negotiation?" "You may ask." "Have we truly never met before today? I do not mean the market square, though I confess I thought of you again after that encounter more than I probably should have. I mean before that, somewhere further back." Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it, wolf hearing being what it was, sharp enough to catch a heartbeat across a room, let alone a corridor this narrow. She thought of the mask, the ballroom, the desperate scramble over the garden wall, and forced herself to hold his gaze without flinching. "I do not know what you mean, my lord." "There was a woman," Damien said slowly, "at a gathering some months ago. I never learned her name, but something about the way you just answered that question, the way you avoid looking directly at anything you do not wish to discuss, it reminded me of her." "I am sorry I cannot help you find her," Elena said, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth, because they were, in the strictest technical sense, entirely true, and also the largest lie she had ever told. Damien studied her for a long moment, long enough that Elena felt the silence pressing against her ribs like a physical weight. Then, finally, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. "Safe travels back to Fen Hollow," he said quietly. "I hope our paths cross again." Elena did not respond, afraid that her voice would betray more than her words ever could, and she walked quickly down the corridor, out through the estate's front gate, and did not stop walking until the palace was well out of sight behind her. She did not know, as she made her way back toward Fen Hollow beneath a darkening sky, that Marcus Kane had already begun quietly assembling the pieces Nora had brought him weeks earlier. Cross-referencing old bloodline records with the scattered village, reports his own network had gathered, narrowing his search toward the same small cluster of border settlements Elena had been drifting between. She did not know that a plan was already forming in Marcus's mind, one that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with power, a plan that required, above all else, that he find the masked woman before Damien ever managed to piece together the truth on his own. 3 men entered Fen Hollow on a gray afternoon, dressed plainly enough to pass as traders, though Elena noticed immediately that their eyes moved through the town with a precision no ordinary merchant ever bothered with. She was mending nets near the riverbank when she first saw them, and something instinctive in her recognized danger before her conscious mind had assembled a single concrete reason for the feeling. She kept working, forcing her hands to stay steady, and watched from the corner of her eye as the men spoke briefly with the owner of the bakery where she rented her room. The owner glanced toward the riverbank, and one of the strangers followed his gaze directly to where Elena sat among the fishing nets. She did not wait to find out what they wanted. Elena set down her work with deliberate slowness, as though nothing at all had changed, and walked calmly toward the tree line at the edge of the settlement, away from the direction the strangers had come from. Once the trees closed around her, blocking her from view, she broke into a run, her heart hammering with a fear that felt different from anything she had experienced during the earlier searches. Those men had not carried themselves like royal guards. They had carried themselves like hunters who did not particularly care whether their target arrived alive. She heard them behind her within minutes, moving faster than she had expected, and she cut sharply off the main path into denser brush, branches tearing at her sleeves and her hair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had grown up learning these kinds of woods, though this particular forest was unfamiliar territory, and unfamiliarity cost her precious seconds every time she had to choose a direction on instinct rather than memory. A hand closed around her arm from behind, wrenching her to a stop hard enough to spin her around, and Elena found herself staring into the face of a man twice her size, his expression utterly without warmth. "You have caused a great deal of trouble for a woman nobody has ever heard of," he said. "Alpha Kane would like a word." Elena drove her elbow backward into his ribs with every bit of strength panic could summon, twisting free of his grip for just long enough to stumble 2 steps before a second man caught her from the side. She screamed, not out of any hope that help was nearby, but because instinct demanded it, and the sound tore through the quiet forest louder than she expected. It was answered, impossibly, by the sound of hoofbeats crashing through the underbrush at speed. Felix Bram had been traveling the border road on unrelated business, escorting a minor trade shipment back toward the estate, when Elena's scream reached him through the trees. He did not hesitate to investigate, both because it was simply his nature and because 11 years of service had taught him that screams in border territory rarely resolved themselves without intervention. He arrived at the clearing just as the first man drew a short blade, and the sight of a royal guard's insignia was apparently enough to send both remaining strangers scattering into the trees rather than risk a fight against a trained soldier. Elena, breathing hard, one sleeve torn and a shallow cut along her forearm from where the blade had grazed her during the struggle, stared up at the mounted guard with an expression somewhere between relief and fresh terror, because a royal guard represented a different danger entirely from the one she had just escaped. "Are you hurt badly?" Felix asked, dismounting quickly. "I will be fine," Elena said, pressing a hand against the cut on her arm, keeping the injured limb angled away from him instinctively, though she was not entirely sure why the instinct mattered so much in that moment. "Those men, did you recognize them? Do you know why they attacked you?" "No," Elena lied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I do not know." Felix studied her for a moment, clearly unconvinced, but he did not press the matter, focusing instead on the practical concern of getting her somewhere safe. "There is a healer's house not far from here, along the estate road. I will escort you there myself." "That is not necessary." "With respect, I disagree. Whoever those men were, they were not simple bandits. Bandits do not travel in disciplined groups, looking for one specific person by description. You need somewhere safe tonight, and I am not willing to leave you alone on this road after what I just witnessed." Elena wanted to argue further, wanted to insist she could manage on her own, but the truth was that fear had left her hands shaking and her legs unsteady, and the offer of safety, however dangerous it might prove in other ways, was difficult to refuse in the moment. She allowed Felix to help her onto his horse, and they rode in silence toward the healer's house he had mentioned, a modest cottage at the edge of the estate's outer lands, run by an elderly woman who asked no questions Elena was unwilling to answer. The healer cleaned and bandaged the cut on her arm, declared it shallow enough to heal without complication, and left Elena alone in a small guest room to rest, while Felix, true to his word, remained stationed outside to ensure no further trouble found her that night. It was well past midnight when a soft knock sounded at the door, and Elena, still awake, tense despite the apparent safety of the cottage, opened it to find not Felix but Damien himself, standing in the dim hallway, his expression carrying an urgency she had not seen from him before. "Felix sent word to the estate the moment he found you," Damien said, before she could ask how he had come to be there so quickly. "He described the attack, the men, the injury. I came as soon as I could." Elena's breath caught, her exhaustion and lingering fear leaving her too depleted to construct the careful distance she normally maintained around him. "You did not need to come yourself, my lord. I disagree entirely." He stepped closer, close enough that Elena could see the genuine worry etched into his features, worry that seemed far too personal for a king checking on the welfare of a translator he had employed only once. "Are you truly unharmed?" "A shallow cut, nothing more." "May I see it?" Elena hesitated, acutely aware that the bandage covered the same forearm where, higher up, hidden currently by her sleeve, the pale bloodline mark rested against her skin. She held out her arm carefully, angling it so the bandage was visible without exposing anything further, and Damien examined the wound with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous with the authority he carried in every other aspect of his bearing. "I want to know who sent those men," he said quietly, releasing her arm. "This was not a random attack. Someone specifically wanted you found, and I intend to learn who." "It could have been simple bandits, my lord." Fen Hollow sits along enough trade routes to attract that kind of danger. Bandits do not retreat the moment they see a single guard's insignia. Trained men retreat when they calculate that a fight is no longer worth the risk. Whoever sent them was cautious, organized, and specifically interested in you. His gaze held hers, steady and searching. I intend to find out why, Mila, and I intend to keep you safe while I do. Elena said nothing, because there was nothing safe left to say, and the weight of his concern settled over her like something she both desperately wanted and knew. With growing certainty, she could not allow herself to keep. Damien insisted, over Elena's protests, that she remain at the healer's cottage under guard for several days, while Felix and his men investigated the attack. Elena tried twice to argue that she needed to return to Fen Hollow, to her work and her small rented room, but each time Damien countered with a calm, immovable logic that left her with no reasonable objection. Whoever had sent those men clearly knew where to find her, and returning to the same exposed location before the threat was understood would be reckless in the extreme. She stayed, and over the following days, something shifted between them that Elena found impossible to guard against, no matter how carefully she tried. Damien visited the cottage every evening, ostensibly to update her on the investigation's progress, though the conversations rarely stayed confined to that subject for long. He asked about her life in Fen Hollow, her work mending nets, the grandmother who had taught her the river dialect. Elena answered carefully, weaving truth and invention together until she sometimes struggled to remember which pieces belonged to Mila and which belonged to herself. "You have an interesting way of avoiding questions about your family," Damien observed one evening, settled in the chair beside her bed while the healer's cottage grew dim around them. "You will tell me a story about your grandmother in perfect detail, and then go entirely quiet the moment I ask about your parents, or your sisters, or where you grew up before Fen Hollow. Perhaps I simply prefer talking about pleasant subjects. Perhaps." He studied her, unconvinced but apparently unwilling to press further that night. "Or perhaps there is something you are protecting." Elena's chest tightened, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Everyone protects something, my lord." "Damien," he said, "please. You have earned that much after everything this past week." The use of his given name, offered so simply, settled something warm and dangerous in Elena's chest, and she found herself, against every careful instinct she had built over the past weeks, wanting to lean into the warmth rather than guard against it. It was on the 5th evening that Grace arrived. Elena heard the commotion outside the cottage before she understood its cause, raised voices at the gate, one of them achingly familiar despite months of separation. She rose from the bed too quickly, ignoring the healer's protest about her still healing arm, and reached the front room, just as Felix's guards allowed a travel-worn Grace through the gate, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and barely restrained panic. "Grace!" Elena crossed the room and gripped her sister's hands. "What are you doing here? How did you even find me? Ivy sent word to Hollow Bend that you had left Brackenfield without explanation, and then I heard from a trader passing through our village about an attack near Fen Hollow, involving a woman matching your description, taken to a healer under the king's protection." Grace's eyes were wide with a fear that went beyond simple relief at finding her sister alive. "Elena, we need to speak privately. Immediately." Elena led her sister to a quiet corner of the cottage garden, away from the guards stationed near the entrance, and Grace's carefully held composure finally cracked the moment they were alone. "Marcus Kane knows," Grace whispered. "About the mark. I do not know how, but a man came to our village asking very specific questions. Questions no ordinary searcher would think to ask. About our mother's bloodline. About an old mark passed through the women in our family. He was working for the Kane Pack, Elena. I am certain of it." The blood drained from Elena's face. How could he possibly know about the mark specifically? "I do not know. But if he knows enough to ask the right questions, then it is only a matter of time before he connects everything together. The mask, the mark, you." And if he finds a way to expose it to the Pack Council before Damien even understands what he is dealing with, I do not know what will happen to you, or to the rest of our family. Elena thought immediately of the men in the forest, their disciplined precision, their calculated retreat the moment Felix appeared. Not bandits at all. Marcus's men sent not simply to find her, but to secure her, likely as proof of exactly the secret Grace now confirmed he already suspected. I have to leave, Elena said, the words tasting like defeat even as she spoke them. Tonight, before Marcus finds another opportunity. And go where? Elena, you cannot keep running forever. Eventually there will be nowhere left that is far enough. I do not have another option, Grace. If I stay here, under the king's protection, and Marcus exposes what I am before I have found a way to explain it myself, everything becomes so much worse. For me, and for Damien, and for you. Do you truly believe that leaving quietly solves anything? Grace's voice softened, though the intensity in her eyes did not fade. Elena, I watched the way that man looked at you when he brought you inside just now, before he even knew I had arrived. That is not simple concern for an injured translator. If half of what people whisper about fated bonds is true, running from him will not undo whatever has already begun. It will only mean he learns the truth from someone else, in the worst possible way, instead of from you. Elena had no answer for that, because some quiet, honest part of her recognized the truth in it, even as every instinct built over years of careful secrecy screamed at her to run regardless. She stood in the cottage garden as the evening deepened around them, torn between two paths that both seemed to lead toward the same impossible danger, and for the first time since the night of the ball, she allowed herself to genuinely consider the third option she had refused to entertain until now. Telling him herself before Marcus could twist the truth into a weapon. The thought terrified her more than the men in the forest had. But as she looked back toward the cottage, where Damien stood in the doorway, having apparently come looking for her, his expression shifting to concern at the sight of two women deep in urgent conversation in the darkening garden, Elena understood that the choice, however frightening, could not be postponed much longer. Elena did not get the chance to choose her own moment of truth. 3 days after Grace's warning, while Elena remained at the healer's cottage, weighing every possible way to approach the conversation she owed Damien, a formal envoy arrived at the Ashcroft estate, carrying a message from Marcus Kane. Felix brought word of it to the cottage himself, his expression grim. Alpha Kane has requested an urgent audience, Felix reported. He says he has information regarding the identity of the masked woman from the ball, and that the matter concerns pack law significant enough to require the full council's attention. Elena's stomach dropped. Grace, seated beside her, gripped her hand tightly. He knows I am here, Elena said quietly. He must. There is no other reason for the timing. We do not know that for certain, Felix said, though his tone lacked real conviction. Damien arrived at the cottage within the hour, his expression carrying the particular stillness Elena had come to recognize as barely restrained anger. Marcus intends to address the full council tomorrow, he said without preamble. He would not request that formally unless he believed he held something significant enough to force my hand. Damien, Elena said, and the use of his name without title, given how rarely she allowed herself that familiarity, seemed to catch his attention immediately. There is something I need to tell you, something I should have told you days ago. But before she could continue, before the truth she had finally gathered the courage to speak could leave her mouth, a commotion erupted outside the cottage, shouting, the clash of steel, a horse screaming in alarm. Felix was moving before the sound fully registered, drawing his blade and rushing toward the door, and Damien positioned himself instinctively between Elena and the entrance. The attack came fast and coordinated, a dozen armed men descending on the cottage from multiple directions at once, far more organized and far better equipped than the three who had ambushed Elena in the forest weeks earlier. Felix's small guard detachment fought valiantly, but they were badly outnumbered, and within minutes the cottage's defenses had been overwhelmed. Elena felt a hand seize her arm from behind, wrenching her away from Damien even as he fought to reach her, his voice raised in a furious command that was lost beneath the chaos of the fight. A sharp blow to the back of her head sent the world tilting sideways, and the last thing she saw clearly before darkness swallowed her vision was Damien's face, twisted with a desperation that seemed to reach past the noise and violence directly into her fading consciousness. She woke in a stone room she did not recognize, her head throbbing, her wrists bound in front of her with rope that had been tied competently enough to resist any casual attempt at escape. A single narrow window high on the wall let in weak gray light, offering no clue as to how much time had passed since the attack. The door opened, and Marcus Kane entered, dressed impeccably despite the circumstances, his expression carrying the satisfied calm of a man who believed every piece of his plan had fallen exactly into place. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," he said, settling into the room's single chair with unhurried ease. "Months of searching, several failed attempts, and here you are at last. I confess I expected someone more remarkable, given the disruption you have caused an entire kingdom." "What do you want from me?" Elena asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "Nothing so dramatic as you might imagine. I simply need you alive and available when I address the Pack Council tomorrow. Proof, you understand, of exactly what Damien has been so recklessly pursuing. Once the council learns that their beloved king intended to claim a mate carrying a forbidden bloodline mark, his position becomes considerably less secure, and a king with a weakened position tends to require assistance managing his territories. You intend to use me as a political weapon. I intend, Marcus said, to correct an imbalance that has existed between our two packs for far too long. You are simply the instrument that has made it possible." He rose, moving toward the door. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow will be a long day." Elena spent the remaining hours in that stone room cycling through every possible avenue of escape, testing the rope around her wrists until her skin chafed raw, examining the window's height and the door's construction with an increasingly desperate thoroughness that yielded no viable answers. She did not know that beyond the walls of Marcus Kane's estate, Damien had not slept, had not rested, had spent every hour since the attack on the cottage assembling every resource available to him, tracking the trail of Elena's abduction with a single-minded intensity that Felix, riding at his side, had never before witnessed in his king. "We have confirmation," Felix reported, as their party approached the outer boundary of Kane territory under cover of darkness. "She is being held in the eastern wing of Marcus's estate, according to a contact within his own guard who was willing to talk in exchange for protection." "How heavily is it defended?" "Heavily enough that a direct assault would likely get her killed before we reached her if Marcus's men panicked under attack." Damien's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of Marcus's estate, glowing faintly against the night sky. "Then, we do not attack directly. We find another way in." "My lord," Felix said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Ask. Why does this matter so much to you? I do not doubt your instincts about a fated bond, but you have known this woman, in truth, for only a handful of brief encounters. And yet you are prepared to risk open conflict with an entire rival pack to bring her back." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the distant estate. "Because from the very first moment I touched her hand at that ball, something in me recognized her more completely than I have ever recognized anything else in my life. I do not fully understand it myself, Felix. I only know that leaving her in that man's hands is not something I am capable of doing, whatever the cost turns out to be." He turned his horse toward the tree line bordering Marcus's estate, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried the absolute certainty of a king who had already decided the outcome he intended to secure, regardless of the danger standing in his way. "Tonight, we bring her home." The plan Felix devised relied on patience rather than force, a quality Damien found nearly impossible to summon given the circumstances, but he forced himself to follow it regardless, because Felix's caution had kept him alive through 11 years of dangerous service, and tonight was not the night to abandon that trust. Two of Felix's most trusted trackers slipped over the estate's outer wall shortly after midnight, moving through the grounds with the careful silence of wolves who had spent years perfecting exactly this kind of work. Their task was simple in concept and dangerous in execution. Locate the precise room where Elena was being held, disable the guards stationed nearest to it, and create a narrow window of opportunity for a small extraction team to move in and out before the alarm could spread through the rest of the estate. Damien insisted on being part of that extraction team himself, over Felix's strong objections. If something goes wrong and you are captured or killed inside Marcus's own walls, Felix argued, it hands him exactly the political weapon he is trying to build, only far more devastating than anything involving a bloodline mark. If something goes wrong, Damien replied, I want to be the one standing between her and whatever happens next. I am not sending other men into that danger while I wait safely outside a wall. Felix did not win the argument, though he extracted a compromise. Damien would move with the extraction team, but only after the trackers confirmed the guard rotation had been successfully disrupted, and only with a full contingent ready to move in support if the alarm sounded regardless. The signal came just past 2 in the morning, a single low whistle carried faintly on the night wind, and Damien moved over the wall with a speed and silence that surprised even the guards accompanying him. They crossed the dark grounds in a low crouch, following the path the trackers had marked, and reached the eastern wing without incident, the 2 disabled guards lying bound and unconscious in the shadow of a garden hedge. Inside, the corridor was empty, lit only by widely spaced torches that left long stretches of shadow between pools of orange light. Damien moved toward the door the trackers had identified, his heart pounding with an intensity that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the climb. The door was locked, but Felix made short work of it, and Damien stepped inside to find Elena seated against the far wall, her wrists still bound, her eyes widening with a shock that quickly transformed into desperate relief the moment she recognized him. Damien! Her voice broke on his name. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her, working at the rope binding her wrists with hands that were not quite steady. I have you. We are getting you out of here now. How did you find me so quickly? I was not about to let anything stop me from finding you. The rope finally gave way, and he pulled her to her feet, one hand steadying her when her legs, stiff from hours of confinement, threatened to buckle. Can you run? Yes. They moved back toward the corridor, Felix leading, 2 guards flanking Elena protectively, but they had covered barely half the distance back toward the garden wall when a shout rang out behind them, followed almost immediately by the deep, resonant sound of an alarm bell. Move, Felix commanded, and the small group broke into a full run, boots pounding against stone as the estate around them erupted into sudden, chaotic activity, guards spilling from barracks and corridors in response to the alarm. They reached the garden just as a squad of Marcus's men converged on the wall ahead of them, blocking the path back to the horses waiting beyond. Felix's small contingent formed a defensive line without hesitation, and the resulting clash of steel filled the night air with a violence Elena had never witnessed this closely before. Wolves fighting in the space between human and something far more primal. Movements too fast for her eyes to fully track. In the chaos, a stray blow from one of Marcus's men caught the sleeve of Elena's dress, tearing it open along her forearm, and the pale mark hidden beneath was suddenly, unmistakably visible in the torchlight. Damien, fighting beside her to hold the perimeter, caught sight of it in the space between one strike and the next, and something in his expression shifted with a force Elena felt even amid the surrounding violence. Recognition, understanding, the final piece of a puzzle he had been assembling, without fully realizing it, since the moment he first held her hand at the ball. He did not stop fighting. He did not pull away from her or hesitate in his defense of the small group struggling toward the wall. But when their eyes met across the chaos, Elena saw, unmistakably, that he finally knew exactly who she was, and exactly what she had been hiding from him since that very first night. They broke through the line moments later, Felix's forces overwhelming the guards, blocking their path just long enough to clear a path to the wall, and the group scrambled over it and into the waiting darkness beyond, mounting horses and riding hard away from Marcus's estate before reinforcements could organize a proper pursuit. They rode for nearly an hour before Damien finally called a halt, deep enough into neutral territory that immediate pursuit seemed unlikely. Elena dismounted on legs that still trembled from exhaustion and fear, and found Damien already standing beside his horse, watching her with an expression she could not fully read in the darkness. Relief, certainly, but layered beneath it something sharper, more wounded. "You knew," he said quietly, once the rest of the group had moved a respectful distance away to tend the horses. "This entire time, the ball, the market square, the negotiation, all of it, you knew exactly who you were to me, and you let me search for months without ever telling me the truth." "Damien, do not." His voice was not unkind, but it carried a rawness Elena had never heard from him before. "I need to understand why. Before anything else between us moves forward, I need to understand why you chose to hide this from me, even after everything that has happened." Elena felt the weight of every careful secret she had carried since the night of the ball pressing down on her all at once, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, she allowed the full truth, unguarded and unpolished, to finally leave her mouth. "Because the mark on my wrist makes any bond between us forbidden under the oldest laws your council still recognizes," she said. "Because I was terrified that the moment you learned what I truly was, everything I felt when you looked at me would turn to something closer to obligation, or pity, or worse. Because I did not know how to walk into your world and tell you that loving me would cost you your crown, and I could not bear to be the reason you lost everything you had built." Damien was silent for a long moment, the night wind stirring the grass between them, and when he finally closed the distance and took her hands in his grip was gentle despite the intensity still burning in his eyes. "You should have trusted me with that fear," he said, "instead of carrying it alone. I know that now. Then let us make certain," he said quietly, "that you never have to carry anything like it alone again." The Pack Council convened 3 days later, summoned by Marcus Kane's original request and now impossible to postpone, given how many elders and representatives had already traveled to the Ashcroft estate in anticipation of a significant announcement. The Grand Hall, still bearing faint traces of the decorations from the masquerade ball months earlier, had been rearranged into a formal chamber, long tables arranged in a wide circle to accommodate the assembled representatives of every major pack in the kingdom. Elena stood near the entrance, dressed simply, deliberately avoiding anything that might suggest she was attempting to present herself as anything other than exactly who she was. Grace stood beside her, having arrived 2 days earlier, once word reached her that Elena had been safely recovered, her presence a steady source of comfort against the nervous tremor Elena could not quite banish from her hands. "You do not have to do this," Grace whispered, as the council members took their seats. "Damien could address the council alone. You could remain outside until it is decided." "No," Elena said. "I have spent months letting other people decide how much of the truth the world was allowed to see. I am done with that." Marcus Kane rose first, as was his right, having called the session, and addressed the assembled council with the polished confidence of a man entirely certain of the outcome he had engineered. "Esteemed council," he began, "I bring before you a matter of grave importance to the future stability of this kingdom. Several months ago, our Alpha King canceled a formal mate-choosing ceremony in pursuit of an unknown woman he encountered at a masquerade ball. That woman has since been identified. She carries a bloodline mark explicitly forbidden under the ancient laws governing union with a ruling Alpha, laws established generations ago specifically to protect the stability of pack leadership from bloodlines with a history of divided loyalty and unstable power." A murmur rippled through the assembled council, and Marcus continued, gesturing toward Elena where she stood near the entrance. I present the woman in question, currently standing before you, as proof of my claim. I ask this council to formally reaffirm the ancient law and to require our king to abandon this pursuit before it further destabilizes the kingdom's leadership. Victor Cray, seated among the eldest of the council members, rose next, his expression grave. The law Marcus references is genuine and long-standing. I have studied it myself in the old records. If this woman does carry the mark he describes, the law is unambiguous. A union would not be permitted. Damien rose then, and the hall fell silent in a way that no amount of ceremony could have manufactured on its own. The law exists, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. I do not dispute that, but I ask this council to consider something Marcus has conveniently failed to mention in his presentation, the reason that law was written in the first place. He gestured toward one of the estate's scholars, seated near the back of the hall, who rose and unrolled an ancient scroll he had spent the past 2 days retrieving from the deepest archives of the estate library. The bloodline restriction was established 4 generations ago, the scholar explained, following a period when a rival pack attempted to place a hidden agent within the ruling family through exactly this kind of union, an agent whose loyalty ultimately proved divided in a moment of crisis, nearly costing the kingdom its stability entirely. The law was never intended to punish an entire bloodline for one ancestor's betrayal. It was intended to prevent divided loyalty from threatening the throne. Damien turned to face the council directly. I ask this council, then, to consider the woman standing before you not as an abstract bloodline, but as an individual. I ask you to judge her, if you must judge her at all, by her own actions, and not by the actions of an ancestor she never knew. A noble sentiment, Marcus interjected smoothly, but the law does not concern itself with individual character, only with bloodline. Sentiment cannot override 4 generations of established precedent. Then let precedent be tested against truth, Elena said, stepping forward before she had fully decided to speak, her voice ringing out across the hall with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Every eye in the chamber turned toward her, and for one suspended moment, Elena felt the full weight of the decision she was about to make. The choice to step forward, unguarded, before the most powerful gathering of wolves in the kingdom, and claim her own story rather than let Marcus continue shaping it for her. I did not seek this mark, she said. I did not choose the ancestor who carried it before me, any more than any of you chose the ancestors who built the reputations your own family names now carry. I have spent my entire life hidden at the edges of pack society, specifically because of a warning passed down through my mother, generation after generation, that this mark would make me a target the moment anyone powerful learned of it. She looked directly at Marcus as she continued, and I was right to be afraid, because the very first time someone powerful did learn of it, he did not seek to understand the truth behind the law before invoking it. He sought only to use it as a weapon, dragging me from a healer's cottage in the middle of the night, holding me against my will, and presenting me to this council not as a person, but as evidence in a political maneuver designed to weaken a king he has resented for years. A fresh murmur swept through the chamber, several council members exchanging troubled glances, and Marcus's composed expression flickered, just slightly, for the first time since the session began. I do not ask this council to overturn 4 generations of law lightly, Elena continued. I ask only that, before you reaffirm it, you consider whether the law, as written, still serves the purpose it was created for, or whether it has simply become a tool for men who have learned to weaponize old fears against people who never had any part in creating them. Silence held the chamber for a long moment after she finished, and Damien, watching her with an expression of undisguised pride, turned back to face the assembled council. I will not abandon her, he said, his voice absolute. If this council insists on upholding the law exactly as written, without allowing for the truth the scholar has just presented, then I will step aside from the throne rather than betray the bond I have found. But I do not believe this council is truly willing to let one ambitious alpha's political scheme dictate the future of this kingdom's leadership over a law that has clearly outlived the danger it was written to prevent. Victor Cray sat in contemplative silence for a long moment, then rose slowly, his gaze moving between Damien, Elena, and finally settling, coldly, on Marcus. "I would like," he said, "to hear more about exactly how Alpha Kane came to possess such detailed knowledge of this woman's private bloodline in the first place, before this council makes any further decisions today." Marcus's composed expression finally cracked entirely, and Elena watched, with a slow-building sense of hope she had not allowed herself to feel in months, as the careful weapon he had built against her began, piece by piece, to turn back against the man who had forged it. Marcus attempted, briefly, to deflect Victor's question with vague references to loyal informants and a duty to protect the kingdom's ancient laws, but the council, once its attention had been drawn toward the manner of his investigation rather than simply its conclusions, proved far less willing to accept vague answers than he had anticipated. It was Nora Ashwell, summoned before the council 2 days later, once word of the session's contentious outcomes spread through the kingdom, who ultimately provided the detail that unraveled the rest of Marcus's scheme entirely. Facing formal questioning under the council's authority, and having grown increasingly uneasy about the abduction Marcus had ordered without her knowledge or consent, Nora confirmed that she had first identified Elena's mark during the diplomatic visit to Brackenfield, and that she had reported it directly and exclusively to Marcus, who had subsequently ordered both the earlier ambush in the forest and the abduction from the healer's cottage. "I informed him only of the mark itself," Nora told the council, her voice tight with the particular discomfort of someone realizing too late how far her information had been weaponized. "I did not know he intended to have her taken by force. I believed, foolishly, that he intended only to raise the matter formally before this council, as he ultimately claimed to have done." The revelation shifted the council's mood decisively. An abduction carried out against an unranked woman, regardless of her bloodline, violated laws far less ambiguous than the old restriction Marcus had attempted to invoke, and several council members who had initially seemed sympathetic to Marcus's argument found their sympathy rapidly evaporating under the weight of his own conduct. Marcus, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against him, made one final attempt to salvage his position, rising before the council with what remained of his composure. "Whatever my methods," he said, "the underlying law remains valid. This council cannot simply set aside 4 generations of precedent because you find my conduct distasteful." "No," Victor Cray agreed, rising to address the chamber one final time. "But this council can, and I believe now should, examine whether the precedent itself still serves any legitimate purpose, separate entirely from how it has been misused. I have listened to the scholar's account of the law's original intent. I have listened to this woman's account of a lifetime spent in fear because of an ancestor's actions she had no part in, and I have listened to Alpha Kane's own conduct, which suggests to me that the true danger to this kingdom's stability lies not in bloodline, but in ambition unchecked by honor." He turned to face the full assembly. "I move that this council formally abolish the bloodline restriction as it currently stands, and replace it with language that judges individuals by their own conduct and loyalty, rather than the actions of ancestors long dead. And separately, I move that this council formally censure Alpha Kane for the abduction of an unranked civilian, an act that violates protections this council has upheld for far longer than the restriction currently under debate." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous, but it was decisive, a clear majority of the assembled council voting in favor of both measures. Marcus left the chamber that day stripped of significant standing among his fellow alphas, his reputation for careful political maneuvering replaced, almost overnight, by a reputation for reckless overreach that would follow him for years to come. Elena stood in the grand hall long after the council had dispersed, still absorbing the reality that the fear she had carried her entire life, the fear that had shaped every careful decision, every stolen name, every desperate flight from one hiding place to another, had finally been dismantled, not by hiding further, but by finally standing still and telling the truth. "You did that," Damien said quietly, coming to stand beside her once the hall had emptied. "Not the scholar's records, not my arguments. You, standing in front of the most powerful people in this kingdom, and refusing to let Marcus define your story for you. We did it together," Elena said. "I do not think either of us could have managed it alone." Damien reached for her hand, and this time, standing in the same hall where they had first danced together as strangers hiding behind masks and false names, there was nothing left to conceal between them. "I made a promise to myself, the night you disappeared over that garden wall," he said, "that if I ever found you again, I would not let you go without knowing, completely, who you were choosing to be with. Not a mask, not a false name. You. You have known who I am for some time now," Elena said, a small smile finally breaking through the exhaustion of the past months. Torn sleeves and stolen invitations included. "Then perhaps it is time the rest of the kingdom knew as well." He drew a small velvet box from inside his coat, and Elena felt her breath catch as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring, clearly crafted with far more care than a spontaneous gesture would have allowed. "I had this made the week after the council's decision. I did not want to wait any longer than necessary." Elena looked up at him, at the man who had spent months hunting through villages and market towns, not out of possessiveness, but out of a certainty he had never once abandoned, even when every practical reason argued that he should. "You are certain, even knowing everything my bloodline once represented to this kingdom?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." The formal announcement came 2 weeks later, delivered not in the grand hall but in the same gardens where Elena had once fled over a stone wall in desperate fear of discovery. This time, she walked through those gardens in daylight, beside Damien, in front of a gathering that included not only the reconciled Pack Council but Grace, Ivy, Felix, and a small crowd of villagers who had traveled from Hollow Bend and Fen Hollow alike, curious to witness the conclusion of a story that had, by then, spread throughout the entire kingdom. Elena Voss became, officially, the future queen of the Ashcroft Pack that afternoon. No mask required, no false name necessary. Her bloodline mark no longer a secret to be hidden, but simply one part of a history that no longer had any power to define her future. Marcus Kane watched the ceremony from a distance, having been permitted to attend only as a condition of his continued standing among the council, his expression unreadable as the kingdom he had once hoped to destabilize instead settled into a stronger, more united future than it had known in generations. And Elena, standing beside Damien as the gathered crowd cheered their union, found herself thinking not of the fear that had once driven her into hiding, but of the simple truth that had, in the end, set her free. That the story others tried to write about her had never mattered nearly as much as the one she finally found the courage to tell herself.